Welcome to Adu Globe. Discover new ideas, learn exciting things, and be amazed every day. A political shockwave is spreading across Europe. The roadblock that has kept Ukraine knocking on the doors of the European Union for years suddenly seems to be dissolving. And behind this dramatic shift lies one surprising detail: a phone call between former U.S. President Donald Trump and Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban. This revelation has exploded like breaking news, stirring up suspense across the continent. Since December 2023, Ukraine has been pushing relentlessly to join the European Union. Yet every step forward has been blocked by the same man, Viktor Orban. Using his veto power, the Hungarian leader repeatedly halted the process, leaving European leaders frustrated and Ukraine's aspirations suspended. For months, this political deadlock created uncertainty, fueling anger inside Brussels and despair in Kyiv. Now comes the bombshell. United 24 reported, citing Politico and unnamed diplomatic sources, that on August 27, Donald Trump and Viktor Orban held a private phone call. And soon after, the situation reportedly shifted. The claim: Orban suddenly appeared ready to end his blockade. But what exactly was said during that call? Was it pressure, a secret deal, or perhaps an irresistible offer? The truth remains hidden, wrapped in mystery. This story has ignited an atmosphere of suspense across Europe. Analysts are debating fiercely, yet the reality remains clouded in secrecy. Could one phone call really wield so much power? Or is there a much larger deal behind the scenes that the public has yet to discover? The next step is to zoom out, expanding the canvas beyond Ukraine, and bringing Moldova into the frame, transforming this from just a phone call into a potential geopolitical shift for all of Europe. The focus now shifts to Moldova, a small nation suddenly at the center of Europe's geopolitical chessboard. According to Politico, leaders from Germany, France, and Poland are set to travel there, aiming to counterbalance Russian influence and sustain momentum for Moldova's pro-EU government. Their visit is being framed as a critical moment to keep the European project alive beyond Ukraine. Moldova's politics remain fragile. In previous elections, the EU referendum was decided by the slimmest of margins, with constant allegations of vote rigging and Kremlin-linked schemes haunting the process. This razor-thin divide has made the country a battleground between East and West, where every single vote counts. The message is clear: August could deliver two historic victories for the European Union, Ukraine on one side, and Moldova on the other. If both succeed, it won't just be an expansion of the EU, it will be a dramatic shift in the very balance of power on the continent. For years, Viktor Orban has been the EU's most stubborn obstacle on Ukraine. In December 2023, he went so far as to veto a massive $55 billion aid package meant to support Kyiv. He openly warned Brussels that he could pull the handbrake at any time, sending shockwaves through Europe's leadership. His defiance didn't stop there. When negotiations opened for Ukraine and Moldova's accession talks, Orban staged a dramatic walkout, later abstaining altogether. Only afterward did he call it a bad decision, but the message was unmistakable: Hungary could stall the entire process at will. That image of Orban, as the man holding Europe's future hostage, stuck in everyone's mind. These repeated acts of resistance painted Orban as Europe's spoiler-in-chief. Yet behind the political theater lay deeper reasons: cultural and institutional grievances that would soon come to the surface. The stage was now set to explore why Orban kept saying no to Ukraine in the first place. The conflict between Hungary and Ukraine wasn't born overnight. Long before Russia's full-scale invasion, tensions were brewing over language rights. In 2017, Ukraine passed a new education law, followed in 2019 by a sweeping language law. These reforms restricted the use of minority languages in schools and public life, effectively forcing education to be conducted in Ukrainian. For ethnic Hungarians living in western Ukraine, it felt like their heritage was being erased. Budapest viewed this as a direct attack on its kin. Balázs Tarnok, writing in the Washington Times, argued that Ukraine's laws violated the cultural rights of Hungary's minority. He reminded readers that Hungary's fundamental law obligates the government to protect Hungarians beyond its borders. That constitutional duty became a political weapon. By 2018, Hungary was blocking high-level NATO-Ukraine meetings, openly declaring it would not support a partner that disrespects minority rights. Kyiv, of course, offered its own defense. Ukrainian officials claimed the laws were never aimed at Hungarians specifically, but at reducing Moscow's influence. For decades, Russia had exploited language rights as a tool of interference, particularly in Crimea and Donbass. By making Ukrainian the primary language of education and governance, Kyiv hoped to strengthen national identity and close loopholes Moscow could exploit. But the collateral damage was clear. Smaller groups like Hungarians, Romanians, and Poles lost privileges alongside Russian speakers. Thus, two narratives collided head-on. For Ukraine, language laws were a shield against Russian domination. For Hungary, they were an assault on culture and identity. What made the clash explosive was that both sides believed they were defending their very survival. This legal and institutional deadlock hardened distrust between Kyiv and Budapest. And yet, as the war escalated, it wasn't just about laws anymore. Personal rivalries and bitter political exchanges would deepen the divide even further. The clash between Viktor Orban and Volodymyr Zelensky wasn't just about policies, it became personal. At EU summits in Brussels, cameras often caught Orban deliberately avoiding photos with the Ukrainian leader. In Argentina, during President Javier Milei's inauguration, the two reportedly exchanged harsh words face to face. These gestures may seem small, but in diplomacy, body language speaks volumes. Orban wanted the world to see that his stance against Kyiv wasn't softening. Zelensky himself added fuel to this fire. In April 2022, he pointed out Orban's unusually close ties with Vladimir Putin, a statement that hit Budapest hard. Hungary summoned Ukraine's ambassador in protest, and Foreign Minister Péter Szijjártó went public on Facebook, accusing Kyiv of crossing a line. The message from Budapest was blunt: Hungary would not accept being labeled Moscow's puppet. Yet the suspicion lingered, especially as Orban's rhetoric stayed carefully balanced, condemning the war, yes, but rarely pointing the finger directly at Putin. If words left doubts, Orban's actions raised even more. In October 2023, and again in July 2024, while most European leaders froze ties with Moscow, Orban was photographed shaking hands with Vladimir Putin in Russia. For Kyiv, the image was devastating. At the very moment Ukraine was begging for more sanctions and military aid, one EU member was meeting the man leading the invasion. Orban insisted he was keeping communication channels open. Critics saw it as proof of a leader drifting further from Europe and closer to the Kremlin. These episodes painted a clear picture. This was no longer just about minority laws or EU aid packages. The Orban-Zelensky relationship had turned bitter, layered with suspicion, personal jabs, and Moscow's looming influence. It set the stage for the next question. Was Orban motivated only by cultural grievances, or were energy deals and economic ties with Russia quietly shaping his every move? In October 2024, standing before lawmakers in Strasbourg, Viktor Orban made a statement that rattled European leaders: Ukraine cannot win this war militarily. The only path is a ceasefire and negotiations. It echoed Donald Trump's line almost word for word. For Orban, this wasn't just commentary, it was his guiding policy. He was openly rejecting the idea of an all-out Ukrainian victory, pushing instead for dialogue that many in Kyiv view as a disguised surrender. That skepticism wasn't limited to the battlefield. United 24 highlighted how Orban doubled down online, posting a consultation that read bluntly, "No to Ukraine in the EU." It was a message aimed not just at Brussels, but at Hungarian voters, reinforcing the narrative that bringing Ukraine into Europe would destabilize the Union and hurt Hungary's interests. Behind the politics lies hard economics. Data from Trading Economics revealed that in 2024, Hungary exported goods worth $1.04 billion to Russia. At the same time, reports from Balkan Insight showed Hungary transforming into a hub for Russian gas, a lifeline that gives Orban leverage but ties Budapest's fate tightly to Moscow's pipelines. These aren't just numbers on a chart. They explain why Hungary has been reluctant to sever ties, even as the rest of Europe isolates Putin's regime. By June 2025, Orban's rhetoric grew even sharper. He declared, "We do not want to be in a community with a country at war." The implication was unmistakable. Hungary would block Ukraine's EU accession as long as the conflict raged. Yet just weeks later, the narrative shifted. On August 18, After a reported phone call with Donald Trump, the same Orban who had said no suddenly appeared ready to say yes. A U-turn that raises the ultimate question: was it pressure, persuasion, or a secret deal that flipped Hungary's position? Bringing Ukraine into the European Union would not just be a symbolic expansion, it would be a seismic shift in Europe's balance of power. Analysts at ECIPE stress that EU enlargement chips away at Moscow's influence, pushing the borders of Europe's democratic space further east. For Brussels, it isn't only about Ukraine's future, it's about signaling to the Kremlin that Europe is no longer negotiable terrain. Every step toward EU membership is a step that shrinks Russia's leverage in the region. Then comes the military angle. Reports from the Tony Blair Institute argue that integrating Ukraine into the EU would strengthen Europe's collective security. Ukraine already commands one of the largest standing armies on the continent, battle-tested against Russia's aggression. Adding that force to the EU's strategic framework would reshape Europe's defense posture, shifting it from reliance on NATO alone to a union with its own hardened shield. For some, that prospect is reassurance. For others, it risks dragging the EU deeper into direct confrontation. Beyond the politics and the armies lies a quieter but equally decisive factor: food. Before the war, Ukraine was known as the breadbasket of Europe. Vast stretches of its farmland accounted for a significant share of the continent's grain and sunflower oil exports. The pre-war metrics are staggering. Fertile land covering more than 40% of the country, with outputs that fed not only Europe but markets as far as Africa and Asia. For a union grappling with food security and global supply disruptions, bringing Ukraine's agricultural might inside the EU could transform the bloc into an unrivaled agro-powerhouse. Ukraine is not only fighting on the front lines, it is also fighting in cyberspace and global markets. In 2022, nearly 45% of the country's exports came from IT services. Even in 2024, despite war and blackouts, the World Bank recorded the sector still strong at 38.4%. That shows a nation whose innovation is refusing to collapse. Beyond technology, Ukraine is sitting on treasures the world desperately needs. The BBC reports it holds around 5% of global critical raw materials: lithium, titanium, graphite, and uranium. These resources are the backbone of clean energy, electric cars, and modern defense. What makes it more alarming is that territories currently under Russian control are estimated to contain over $350 billion worth of mineral reserves. This is not just about money, it's about strategic leverage, resources that could decide Europe's future. Experts at the Tony Blair Institute stress that EU membership for Ukraine could help Europe secure its supply chain independence. From batteries to renewable energy, Ukraine could anchor Europe's energy transition and reduce reliance on both Russia and China. For Ukraine, the biggest prize of EU membership is access to the single market, the free movement of goods, services, capital, and people. This system cuts away red tape and makes trade far easier. Already in 2023, the EU stood as Ukraine's largest trading partner, accounting for over 56% of its goods trade, according to the Tony Blair Institute. Imagine what happens when that partnership becomes permanent: seamless exports, shared infrastructure, and integration into Europe's economic bloodstream. This is why lifting Orban's blockade matters. It is not just political drama, it's about reshaping Ukraine's and Europe's future together.